In the dusty settlement of Cedar Ridge, where harsh winds carry both hope and heartbreak, a woman's worth was once measured by what she couldn't give. Margaret Whitmore had endured the cruelest betrayal a wife could face, sold like cattle by the very man who promised to cherish her, all because her womb remained empty. Cast out with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of wounds, she found herself at the mercy of an unforgiving frontier. But sometimes the most broken souls find each other when they need it most. Thomas McKenna, a weathered rancher struggling to raise 5 wild children alone after losing his beloved wife, never expected to find salvation in a discarded woman's quiet strength. What began as simple Christian charity would bloom into something neither dared to dream possible. Could a woman deemed worthless discover her true value in the chaos of an orphaned family's love? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the main street of Cedar Ridge, as Margaret Whitmore clutched her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders. 3 days had passed since Harold had led her to the town square like a piece of livestock, announcing, to anyone who would listen, that his barren wife was available for trade. The memory burned in her chest like a brand, but she forced herself to keep walking toward the general store, her last few coins weighing heavy in her palm. Her wedding ring, a simple band of tarnished gold, caught the light as she pushed open the creaking door. She'd thought about removing it a dozen times, but somehow it remained, a stubborn reminder of vows that had meant everything to her, and nothing to the man who'd spoken them. The bell above the door chimed softly, and she stepped into the dim interior, breathing in the familiar scents of leather, coffee, and tobacco. "Morning, Mrs. Whitmore." The store owner, Samuel Fletcher, nodded respectfully from behind his counter. He was one of the few townspeople who still used her married name, though she wondered how long that courtesy would last. "Good morning, Mr. Fletcher." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I need supplies for the road, whatever these will buy." She placed her remaining coins on the worn wooden counter, counting them out with trembling fingers. Enough for perhaps 2 days of travel if she was careful. Samuel's weathered face softened with sympathy. "Where you headed, if you don't mind my asking?" "West," she said simply, because she had no better answer. West meant away from Harold, away from the shame, away from the life that had crumbled around her like poorly mortared stone. The door chimed again, and Margaret instinctively stepped aside, making herself small as she'd learned to do. A tall man entered, his presence immediately filling the cramped space. His clothes were practical, worn but well-maintained denim and leather, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing features carved by sun and hard work. Behind him came a parade of children, ranging from a girl who couldn't be more than 4 to a lanky boy approaching his teenage years. "Morning, Thomas," Samuel called out. "Usual supplies?" "And then some," the man replied, his voice carrying the weight of exhaustion. "These young ones go through provisions like locusts through wheat." Despite his weariness, there was warmth in his tone when he spoke of the children. Margaret watched from the corner as the children scattered through the store with practiced efficiency. The oldest boy, perhaps 13 or 14, gathered items from a written list with serious concentration. Twin girls, maybe 8 years old, whispered and giggled as they examined penny candy they clearly knew they couldn't have. A boy of perhaps 10 stood guard over the youngest, a tiny girl with corn silk hair who clutched a raggedy cloth doll to her chest. "Pa, can we get peppermint sticks?" one of the twins asked hopefully. Thomas McKenna. Margaret caught his name from Samuel's. Greeting rubbed his bristled jaw. "Not this time, Katie. Maybe next month when we sell the horses." The disappointment was brief, quickly replaced by resigned acceptance that spoke of children who'd learned not to expect extras. Margaret's heart clenched. She recognized that particular brand of disappointment, though hers had come from wanting children at all, rather than wanting treats for the ones she had. "Jimmy, help your sister reach that flour sack," Thomas called to the 10-year-old, who immediately moved to assist the littlest one. Margaret noticed how naturally the children looked after each other, how the older ones automatically tended to the younger without being asked. It spoke of necessity born from loss. As Thomas conducted his business with Samuel, Margaret overheard fragments of conversation that painted a picture of struggle. Late payments, winter preparations, concerns about the upcoming school term. The children waited patiently, their behavior better than most adults she knew, but she could see the wildness beneath their careful manners, the result of too little. Supervision and too much responsibility placed on young shoulders. The youngest girl, Emma, she heard Thomas call her, dropped her doll near Margaret's feet. Without thinking, Margaret bent to retrieve it, examining the carefully mended fabric and lovingly stitched features. "She's beautiful," Margaret said softly, offering the doll back to the child. "What's her name?" Emma shrank back toward her father, but answered in a whisper, "Mama." The simple word hit Margaret like a physical blow. She glanced up to find Thomas watching her with eyes the color of storm clouds, complex emotions flickering across his face. Understanding passed between them. Two people acquainted with loss, though of different kinds. "Emma, what have I told you about talking to strangers?" The oldest boy, Michael, appeared at his sister's side with protective authority beyond his years. "She's not strange," Emma protested. "She's nice, she likes Mama." Margaret rose slowly, acutely aware of the family's attention focused on her. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to disturb." "You didn't," Thomas said quietly. His gaze lingered on her face, taking in details she wished weren't so obvious. The hollowed cheeks from too little food, the careful way she held herself, the quality dress that had seen better days. "You're new to Cedar Ridge." It wasn't a question, but Margaret nodded anyway, just passing through, alone. The concern in his voice was genuine, not judgmental, which surprised her. "Yes." The word came out smaller than she intended. Samuel cleared his throat diplomatically. "Thomas, this is Mrs. Whitmore. Margaret, meet Thomas McKenna and his children." Thomas touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am." His children mumbled polite greetings, their curiosity evident despite their shyness. "Where you bound for?" Thomas asked, echoing Samuel's earlier question. Margaret gestured vaguely westward. "I have family in California." It was a lie, but a necessary one. The truth, that she had nowhere to go and no one to go to, would only invite pity she couldn't bear. Thomas studied her for a long moment, and she had the uncomfortable feeling he saw through her deception. "That's a long journey for a woman alone. Dangerous, too." "I'll manage." She lifted her chin with more confidence than she felt. "Pa, we should go," Michael interjected, glancing toward his younger siblings. "Emma needs her nap, and the twins have chores." Thomas nodded, but didn't immediately move toward the door. Instead, he seemed to be weighing something internal, his gaze moving between Margaret and his children. When he spoke, his words surprised everyone, including himself. "Mrs. Whitmore, I don't suppose you'd consider postponing your journey for a few days?" The question hung in the air like morning mist. "I find myself in need of assistance with the children and the household, just temporarily, you understand, until you're ready to continue west." Margaret stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "I beg your pardon, Pa." Michael's voice carried warning and confusion in equal measure. Thomas held up a hand to quiet his son's concerns. "It's just a thought. The children need someone with a woman's touch, and you, well, you look like you could use a safe place to rest and plan your next steps." The offer was so unexpected, so impossibly kind, that Margaret felt tears threaten. She blinked them back, not trusting herself to speak. Around them, the store had gone quiet, except for the ticking of the wall clock and the distant sound of Emma humming to her doll. "I don't know anything about children," Margaret finally managed, though it wasn't entirely true. She dreamed of children, planned for them, ached for them, but she'd never actually cared for any. "They're not so different from adults," Thomas said with a tired smile. "They just need feeding more often and watching more closely." One of the twins, Katie or Jenny, Margaret couldn't tell them apart yet, tugged on her father's sleeve. "Pa, is she going to be our new mama?" The innocent question sent heat rushing to Margaret's cheeks. "Oh no, sweetheart. Your father is just being kind to a stranger. I couldn't possibly—" "Why not?" Emma piped up, still clutching her doll. "We need a mama. Pa said so." "Emma," Thomas said gently, "what did we discuss about grown-up conversations?" The little girl ducked her head but didn't apologize, and Margaret caught the hint of a smile on Thomas's lips. Despite his attempt at discipline, he wasn't truly upset with his daughter's boldness. "The offer stands," Thomas said to Margaret, his tone carefully neutral. "No obligations beyond helping with meals and keeping the young ones. From burning down the house while I tend the ranch, you'd have your own room, and I'd pay fair wages for your time." Margaret looked around at the 5 expectant faces. Thomas's carefully controlled hope, Michael's protective skepticism, the twins' bright curiosity, and Emma's unguarded enthusiasm. When was the last time anyone had needed her? When had anyone offered her a place, however temporary, where she might be useful rather than burdensome? She stopped, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the decision. Accept, and she risked attachment to people who would eventually send her on her way. Refuse, and she faced the uncertainty of the road, with winter approaching and resources dwindling. But something in Thomas McKenna's storm-grey eyes suggested this was more than charity. There was recognition there. One survivor acknowledging, another offering what comfort they could in a world that seemed determined to break them both. "For a few days," she heard herself say, "until I can arrange proper travel to California." The smile that spread across Emma's face was like sunrise after the longest night, and even Michael's suspicious expression softened into something approaching acceptance. Thomas nodded once, a sharp movement that suggested he'd surprised himself. "As much as anyone." "Then it's settled," he said. "Samuel, add Mrs. Whitmore's supplies to my account. The children and I will see her safely to the ranch." As they prepared to leave the store, Margaret caught sight of herself in the window glass, a woman stepping into an uncertain future with strangers who might become something more. Her reflection showed the same tired face, the same worn dress, the same ring that marked her as someone else's discarded wife. But for the first time in years, she thought she glimpsed something else in her own eyes, something that might, with careful tending, grow into hope. The McKenna Ranch sprawled across a valley sheltered by rolling hills. The main house, a sturdy 2-story structure that had weathered countless seasons. As the wagon rolled up the dirt path, Margaret took in the details that spoke of both prosperity and recent neglect. Well-built fences that needed mending, a vegetable garden overrun with weeds, laundry hanging crooked on lines that sagged from lack of proper attention. "It's not much to look at right now," Thomas said, following her gaze. "Sarah always kept things prettier." His voice caught slightly on his late wife's name, and Margaret understood that she was seeing the ranch through the lens of his grief. The children piled out of the wagon with practiced efficiency, each automatically taking on tasks that spoke of established routine. Michael unhitched the horses while the twins gathered scattered tools from the yard. Jimmy herded Emma toward the house, and Margaret noticed how naturally they moved together, a family unit that had learned to function despite the gaping hole. At its center, Thomas helped Margaret down from the wagon, his calloused hand steady and warm. "I should warn you," he said quietly. "The house it's not what Sarah would have wanted guests to see." Margaret nodded, understanding more than he realized. She'd become intimately familiar with the way grief could transform a once welcoming home into merely a place where people existed rather than lived. The front door opened directly into a large room that served as both kitchen and common area. Margaret's first impression was of overwhelming chaos. Dishes stacked precariously by the sink, clothes draped over chair backs, children's belongings scattered across every surface. But beneath the disorder, she could see the bones of a home that had once been carefully tended. lovingly maintained. A faded blue apron hung from a peg by the stove, its fabric worn soft from years of use. Something about it called to Margaret. Perhaps the way it waited there, as if its owner might return any moment to slip it on and begin preparing supper. "Sarah's apron," Thomas said, noticing her attention, "haven't had the heart to—" Well, he didn't finish the sentence, but Margaret understood. Some artifacts of love were too precious to disturb, even when they served as daily reminders of loss. Emma tugged on Margaret's skirt. "Want to see my room?" Before Margaret could respond, Michael stepped forward. "Emma, Mrs. Whitmore is tired from traveling. She doesn't need to see your mess." "It's not a mess," Emma protested, but her lower lip trembled in a way that suggested this wasn't the first time her older brother had criticized her housekeeping. "I'd love to see your room," Margaret said gently, earning a grateful smile from the little girl and a suspicious look from Michael. The tour that followed revealed a household struggling to maintain normalcy without its maternal anchor. The children's rooms showed the same pattern. Spaces that had once been organized and comfortable, now overrun with the detritus of daily life. Clothes mixed with toys, school books buried under blankets, the accumulated mess of children who were too young to manage entirely on their own, but too proud to admit they needed help. Emma's room was the most heartbreaking. Her tiny bed was made with careful precision, the coverlet pulled tight in a child's attempt at adult competence. But her treasures, a collection of smooth stones, pressed flowers, bits of colorful fabric, were scattered across the floor where she'd been playing, creating a miniature landscape of a 4-year-old's imagination. "This is where Mama used to read to me," Emma said, patting a worn chair by the window. "Pa tries, but he makes all the voices wrong." Margaret's throat tightened. What stories did she read? Bible stories mostly, and fairy tales. The one about the princess who lost her shoe. Emma's face lit up with memory. "Mama said all girls are princesses, even if they don't live in castles." "Your mama was very wise," Margaret said softly. "Will you read to me tonight?" The question was asked with such hope that Margaret couldn't bear to refuse, despite Michael's disapproving presence in the doorway. "If your father says it's all right." Thomas appeared behind his eldest son, and Margaret caught something unguarded in his expression, relief perhaps at seeing his youngest daughter animated in a way she hadn't been for months. "That would be kind of you," he said simply. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of domestic chaos. Margaret found herself swept into the rhythm of the household, helping where she could, while trying not to overstep invisible boundaries. She assisted Jenny, or was it Katie, with mending a torn dress, helped Jimmy locate his missing arithmetic book, and listened patiently as Emma chattered about her doll's elaborate backstory. But it was the dinner preparation that proved most challenging. The kitchen, she discovered, had been barely functional since Sarah's death. The stove was temperamental, the pantry poorly organized, and the children's eating habits had devolved into whatever was quickest and easiest, rather than what was nourishing. "We usually just have bread and whatever's left from yesterday," Michael informed her when she began investigating their food stores. Margaret surveyed the meager supplies with a practiced eye. "Well, let's see what we can do with what we have." She set the children to simple tasks. Emma sorting beans, the twins peeling potatoes, Jimmy chopping wood for the stove while Michael supervised. Thomas disappeared to tend the evening chores, but she caught him glancing through the window more than once, his expression unreadable. As she worked, Margaret felt something stirring within her that had been dormant for too long. Purpose. The simple satisfaction of creating order from chaos, of transforming raw ingredients into something nourishing and comforting. She found herself humming softly as she worked, an old hymn her mother had sung during her own childhood dinner preparations. "You sound like Mama," Emma observed from her perch at the table. "She used to sing when she cooked too." The comment brought silence to the kitchen, and Margaret felt the weight of comparison settling on her shoulders. She wasn't trying to replace Sarah McKenna. She couldn't. and wouldn't presume to, but she could see how any feminine presence might stir complicated emotions in these grieving children. "Your mama must have been a wonderful cook," Margaret said carefully. "She made the best apple pie in 3 counties," Katie, or Jenny, said wistfully. "And her biscuits were so light they practically floated off the plate," Jimmy added. Margaret smiled. "She sounds like a remarkable woman. I hope someday you'll share more of her recipes with me." The dinner she managed to create was simple but substantial. Beef stew made from yesterday's leftover roast, fresh biscuits and green beans from the neglected garden. Nothing fancy, but the children attacked their plates with enthusiasm that spoke of too many meals grabbed on the run. "This is real good, Mrs. Whitmore," Michael said, his tone grudging but sincere. "Thank you, Michael. I'm glad you like it." Thomas ate quietly, but she noticed he cleaned his plate completely, something that didn't escape his children's attention either. When he complimented the meal, his praise carried weight that made her cheeks warm with pleasure. After dinner came the evening routines, and Margaret discovered the true challenge of the McKenna household. Without Sarah's organizing presence, bedtime had become a prolonged negotiation rather than a smooth transition. The twins argued over whose turn it was to wash dishes, Jimmy couldn't find his nightshirt, and Emma dissolved into tears when she realized her doll's dress needed washing. But, gradually, with patience and gentle firmness, Margaret helped restore order. She braided the twins' hair while they told her about their school lessons, helped Jimmy organize his clothes for the next day, and sat with Emma while she said her prayers. "Now remember," Emma said seriously as Margaret tucked her in, "you promised to read to me." Margaret retrieved a well-worn Bible from the bedside table, its pages soft with use and marked with pressed flowers. Sarah's flowers, she realized. She opened to a familiar psalm and began to read, her voice soft in the lamplight. As she read, she became aware of Thomas standing in the doorway, his expression complex. When she finished, and Emma had drifted towards sleep, he followed Margaret. "In from the room. She hasn't asked for a bedtime story since..." He didn't finish the sentence, but Margaret understood. "She's a sweet child. They all are." "They can be difficult," Thomas said. "Especially Michael. He's taken on too much responsibility since his mother died, trying to be the man of the house when he's still just a boy." Margaret nodded. "Grief makes us all reach for control where we can find it." Thomas studied her face in the dim hallway light. "You speak like someone who knows." "We all know loss, Mr. McKenna. Some of us just wear it more quietly than others." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both listening to the settling sounds of a house full of children, gradually finding peace. Finally, Thomas cleared his throat. "Your room is just here," he said, opening a door to reveal a small but clean space. "It was Sarah's sewing room. I hope you don't mind." "It's perfect," Margaret said quickly. And it was. A sanctuary with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the moonlit valley. A place where she could rest without fear, plan without pressure, exist without justifying her presence. "Mrs. Whitmore," Thomas said as she prepared to close the "Dottie, thank you for today. The children, they haven't seemed this settled in months." Margaret felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tight band of worthlessness that had constricted her breathing since Harold's betrayal. "Thank you for giving me a place to belong, even if it's just temporary," as she prepared for bed in the small room that smelled faintly of lavender and old fabric. Margaret caught sight of herself in the mirror above the washstand. The same face looked back at her, but something had changed. The defeated slump of her shoulders had straightened. The hollow look in her eyes had been replaced by something warmer. For the first time in years, Margaret Whitmore felt needed, and that feeling, fragile as new grass after winter, was enough to let her sleep peacefully in a stranger's house, surrounded by the gentle breathing of children who had begun to trust her with their vulnerable hearts. Margaret woke before dawn to the sound of a child crying. For a moment, disorientation clouded her thoughts. She wasn't in Harold's house, wasn't bracing herself for another day of silent disapproval and cutting remarks. She was in Sarah McKenna's sewing room, and somewhere in this house, a little girl needed comfort. She found Emma in the kitchen, sobbing over the wooden doll that lay in pieces on the floor. The carefully sewn dress had torn completely away, and one of the arms had come loose from the body. "Oh, sweetheart," Margaret murmured, kneeling beside the distraught child. "What happened?" "I was trying to fix her hair like yours," Emma hiccuped, "but I pulled too hard and she came apart. Now Mama's gone forever." The despair in those words broke Margaret's heart. She gathered the doll pieces carefully, examining the damage with practiced fingers. Years of mending Harold's clothes and maintaining their household on a threadbare budget had taught her valuable skills. "She's not gone forever," Margaret said gently. "Look, her face is perfect and her body just needs new stitching. I can fix this." Emma's tears slowed. "You can?" "I think so, but I'll need your help. Can you show me where your papa keeps his sewing supplies?" By the time Thomas emerged from his morning chores, he found Margaret and Emma sitting at the kitchen table, working intently on the doll's restoration. Emma held the body steady while Margaret carefully reattached the arm with tiny, precise stitches. "Morning," he said quietly, not wanting to disturb their concentration. "Pa!" Emma bounced excitedly. "Mrs. Whitmore is making Mama all better." Thomas's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Is she now?" Margaret looked up, suddenly aware that she might have overstepped. "I hope you don't mind. Emma was upset and I thought—" "I don't mind," Thomas said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "It's kind of you to help." The awkward moment was broken by the thunder of feet on the stairs as the other children descended for breakfast. Michael appeared first, his hair sticking up at odd angles, followed by the twins in matching nightgowns, and finally Jimmy, who seemed to have grown an inch overnight. "What's for breakfast?" Katie asked hopefully. Margaret glanced toward the stove, then at Thomas. "I wasn't sure if you wanted me to—" "Please," Thomas said, and the exhaustion in his voice was answer enough. Soon the kitchen filled with the scents of frying bacon and fresh biscuits. Margaret moved through the space with growing confidence, finding rhythms that worked around the children's morning routines. She braided Jenny's hair while bacon cooked, helped Jimmy locate his school books while biscuits baked, and listened to Michael's concerns about a difficult arithmetic lesson. "Mrs. Whitmore," Katie said over breakfast, "can you teach us to sew like you're teaching Emma?" "I'm not teaching Emma to sew," Margaret explained. "I'm just helping fix her doll." "But you're real good at it," Jenny observed. "Better than Pa." Thomas cleared his throat. "I do my best." "Pa's good at lots of things," Michael said quickly, shooting his sister a warning look. "He can fix fences and birth calves and shoot rabbits for dinner." "Of course he can," Margaret agreed. "Your father is very capable. But everyone has different skills, and that's what makes families work. People helping each other with their strengths." It was a casual comment, but she saw Thomas glance at her with something like gratitude. After the children left for school, the older ones walking together while Emma stayed home, Margaret found herself alone with Thomas for the first time since arriving. The silence stretched between them, not quite comfortable but not hostile either. "I should explain about Emma's doll," Thomas said finally. "Sarah made it just before, when she knew she wasn't going to recover. She wanted Emma to have something to hold on to." Margaret's fingers stilled on the needle. "I'm sorry. I didn't realize. If you'd rather I not—" "No," Thomas said quickly. "No, you're helping. It's just everything reminds them of her. Everything reminds me of her. Sometimes I don't know if that's healing or if it's keeping us all stuck in the past." Margaret considered her words carefully. "Maybe it's both. Maybe that's all right for now." Thomas studied her face. "You lost someone too." It wasn't a question, but Margaret nodded anyway. "Not the same way you did. But yes, I understand how. The past can feel more real than the present sometimes." They worked in companionable silence after that, Thomas mending a bridle while Margaret finished restoring Emma's doll. The morning light streamed through windows that could use washing, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. "There," Margaret said finally, holding up the completed repair. "Good as new." Thomas examined her work, his expression surprised. "That's fine stitching. Where did you learn to sew like that?" "Necessity," Margaret said simply. "When you can't afford to replace things, you learn to make them last." Something in her tone made Thomas look at her more closely. "Your husband, Harold, wasn't it? What kind of man sells his wife?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Margaret set down her needle, choosing her words with care. "The kind who measures a woman's worth by what she can produce for him. When I couldn't give him children, I became expendable." "That's not a man," Thomas said quietly. "That's something less." The fierce protectiveness in his voice surprised her. When was the last time anyone had defended her honor, even in retrospect? "It doesn't matter now," she said. "That life is behind me." "Is it?" Thomas asked. "Because yesterday you talked about family in California, but today you sound like someone who's been running from something rather than towards something." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I don't see how that's your concern." "It's my concern because you're in my house, caring for my children," Thomas said, but his tone remained gentle. "I need to know if trouble might follow you here." The question was fair, even if it stung. Margaret met his gaze directly. "Harold won't come looking for me. I was a burden to him, not a treasure, and there is no family in California." I lied because the truth seemed pitiful. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "What is the truth?" "That I have nowhere to go and no one who wants me there." The admission came out steadier than she felt. "That I was planning to travel until my money ran out, and then, well, I hadn't thought that far ahead." "And now?" Margaret looked around the kitchen that was already beginning to feel familiar. "Now, I'm grateful for a few days of purpose while I figure out what comes next." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then we understand each other." The afternoon brought its own challenges and small victories. Emma delighted in her restored doll, insisting on introducing Margaret to each of the toy's intricate features and personality traits. When the school children returned, Margaret had warm milk and leftover biscuits waiting, a simple kindness that earned her shy smiles and gradually lessening suspicion. She helped Katie with her reading lesson, discovered that Jenny had a gift for arithmetic, and listened patiently as Jimmy recounted every detail of his day with the enthusiasm of a 10-year-old who rarely had adult attention for his stories. Even Michael seemed to soften slightly when she asked his advice about organizing the pantry. "Mama always kept the flour up high," he said it stayed fresher that way. "That's very helpful," Margaret replied. "I can see she taught you well about running a household." The boy's chest puffed with pride at the compliment, and Margaret filed away the knowledge that he needed recognition for the burdens he'd shouldered. As evening approached, and she helped prepare another simple but nourishing meal, Margaret realized that something had shifted in the house's atmosphere. The children moved with less of the frantic energy she'd noticed the day before. Their laughter came more easily, their squabbles resolved more quickly. And Thomas, she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, not quite gratitude, not quite curiosity, but something warmer than either. Something that made her pulse quicken in ways she'd forgotten were possible. That night, as she tucked Emma into bed and listened to the child's sleepy prayers, Margaret allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like to belong somewhere again. To be needed, not for what she could produce or provide, but simply for who she was. It was a dangerous thought, but as Emma's breathing deepened into sleep and the house settled into peaceful quiet, Margaret couldn't bring herself to push it away. The end of her first week at the McKenna Ranch, Margaret had fallen into routines that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. Each morning brought the controlled chaos of getting children fed, dressed, and ready for school. Each evening offered the quieter satisfaction of mending clothes, preparing lessons, and listening to the day's adventures and tribulations. It was during one of these evening sessions that Thomas surprised her with a gift. "I made this for you," he said quietly, presenting a beautifully carved wooden spoon. The handle was smooth as silk, worn to perfect ergonomic curves, and the bowl was precisely shaped for stirring and serving. Margaret turned it over in her hands, admiring the craftsmanship. "It's beautiful, but you didn't need to. You've been using that bent old thing Sarah had for everyday cooking," Thomas said, a flush creeping up his neck. "Figured you deserved better tools." The practical nature of the gift somehow made it more precious than any ornament could have been. This wasn't romantic gesture. It was recognition of her contribution, acknowledgement that her presence had value beyond mere temporary convenience. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'll treasure it." From the corner of the room, Emma looked up from playing with her restored doll. "Pa makes the best things. He made my bed, and Jimmy's toy soldiers, and the twins' matching hair combs." "Your papa is very talented," Margaret agreed, watching as Thomas ducked his head with modest embarrassment. "Mama always said Pa could build anything with his hands," Katie added, from where she sat struggling with her arithmetic homework. "She said he could probably build a castle if he wanted to." "Castles are for fairy tales," Michael said dismissively, but there was affection in his voice when he looked at his father. The mention of Sarah no longer brought the awkward silence. It had, in Margaret's first days. Instead, her memory had become a comfortable presence in their conversations, not forgotten, but not a barrier to moving forward either. "Mrs. Whitmore," Jenny said hesitantly, "could you help me with my reading lesson? The teacher says I need to practice more, but the words get all jumbled when I try to read them out loud." Margaret settled beside the girl, noting the way Jenny's face scrunched with concentration as she worked through the simple sentences. "Let's try reading each word separately first, then putting them together. Sometimes our brains need a moment to catch up with our eyes." As they worked together, Margaret became aware of Thomas watching from his chair by the fire. His expression was thoughtful, almost calculating, and she wondered what he was thinking about with such intensity. "You're good with them," he said later, after the children had been tucked into bed. They sat in the kitchen sharing the comfortable ritual of evening coffee. The house settled into peaceful quiet around them. "They're good children," Margaret replied. "A little wild around the edges, but that's to be expected. They've been managing themselves too much." Thomas nodded. "I know I should be stricter with them, more organized about rules and schedules. Sarah always had systems for everything, charts for chores, routines for homework, special traditions for birthdays and holidays. I try, but you're not Sarah," Margaret said gently, "and they don't need you to be. They need you to be their father, which you do beautifully." "Do I?" Thomas's voice carried doubt that ran deep. "Some days I feel like I'm drowning, just trying to keep all the pieces from falling apart. The ranch work, the children's needs, the house, the money concerns, it's like trying to hold water in my bare hands." Margaret studied his profile in the lamplight. Lines of exhaustion carved paths around his eyes, and she could see the weight of responsibility he carried in the set of his shoulders. "What if you didn't have to hold it all alone?" she asked quietly. Thomas turned to look at her directly. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Margaret paused, choosing her words carefully, "what if this arrangement didn't have to be temporary? What if we could find a way to make it work for everyone?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to examine fully. Thomas was quiet for so long that Margaret began to regret her boldness. "You're talking about staying," he said finally. "I'm talking about the possibility of staying, if it would help. If you think the children could accept it long term." "And what would you get out of such an arrangement?" Thomas asked. "Besides room and board?" Margaret considered the question seriously. "Purpose," she said finally. "A place where I'm needed, children to care for, work that matters. That's all." The question seemed to probe deeper than practical arrangements, and Margaret felt her cheeks warm. What else would there be? Thomas was quiet again, his fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table. "I won't pretend to understand what drove your husband to do what he did, but I can tell you that any man who would discard a woman like you is a fool of the highest order." The compliment, delivered with quiet sincerity, hit Margaret like a physical blow. When was the last time a man had spoken to her with such regard? When had anyone suggested she had value beyond her ability to produce children or manage a household efficiently? "Thomas," she began, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish. You've been here a week, and already this house feels more like a home than it has since Sarah died. The children are calmer, happier. They're learning things I can't teach them. How to braid hair properly, how to mend clothes, how to read with expression instead of just sounding out words." Margaret felt tears threatening. "They're wonderful children. Anyone would—" "No," Thomas said firmly. "Not anyone. It takes a special woman to step into a household full of grieving children and somehow make them feel safe enough to laugh again." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of crying from upstairs. Margaret automatically rose to respond, but Thomas caught her hand gently. "Let me," he said. "You've done enough for one day." But as he climbed the stairs, Margaret could hear Emma's tearful voice calling for her specifically. "I want Mrs. Margaret." "Please, Pa, I want Mrs. Margaret." Thomas reappeared at the top of the stairs, his expression rueful. "Seems you're specifically requested." Margaret found Emma sitting up in bed, clutching her doll and shivering despite the warm night. "Bad dream," the little girl whispered. "The monsters came back." "What kind of monsters?" Margaret asked, settling on the edge of the bed. "The kind that take mamas away," Emma said, her voice barely audible. Margaret's heart clenched. She gathered the child close, feeling the small body tremble against her chest. "Oh, sweetheart, dreams can be so scary, can't they?" "Are you going to go away too?" Emma asked. "Like Mama did?" The question hung in the air like a prayer and a challenge combined. Margaret was acutely aware of Thomas standing in the doorway, listening to her answer with an intensity that suggested more than casual interest. "I don't want to go away," Margaret said honestly, "but sometimes grown-ups have to make difficult decisions, and we don't always get to choose what we want most." "But you want to stay." Margaret looked up to meet Thomas's gaze across the dim room. Something passed between them, an understanding, a possibility, a recognition of mutual need that went beyond simple household convenience. "Yes," she said softly. "I want to stay." Emma snuggled closer, her breathing already beginning to deepen towards sleep. "Good. I like having a mama again." The words settled into Margaret's heart, like seeds finding fertile ground. As she tucked Emma back into bed and followed Thomas downstairs, she felt something shifting inside her chest, a loosening of the tight grip of worthlessness she'd carried for so long. "Margaret," Thomas said when they reached the kitchen. Her given name sounded different in his voice, warmer, more personal than the formal address he'd used before. "Yes, about what you said earlier, about making this arrangement more permanent." Margaret held her breath, afraid to hope, afraid to assume. "I think," Thomas said carefully, "we should give serious consideration to that possibility." It wasn't a declaration of love or a proposal of marriage. It was something more practical and, in many ways, more precious, a recognition that they worked well together, that their combined strengths could create something better than either could manage alone. "I'd like that," Margaret said simply, as she prepared for bed that night. Margaret caught sight of herself in the small mirror above her washstand. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the broken creature who had arrived a week ago. This woman stood straighter, smiled more easily, moved with purpose and confidence. This woman looked like someone who belonged somewhere. The wooden spoon Thomas had carved for her sat on her bedside table, catching the moonlight through her window. Tomorrow, she would use it to prepare breakfast for a family that was beginning to feel like her own. And perhaps, if she was very careful and very lucky, tomorrow would be the first day of a future she had never dared to imagine. 3 weeks into her stay at the McKenna Ranch, Margaret had ceased thinking of herself as a temporary guest. The rhythms of the household had absorbed her completely. She knew that Jimmy needed extra encouragement with his reading, that the twins required different approaches to the same arithmetic problems, that Emma's afternoon tantrums could be prevented with a small snack and quiet story time. More importantly, the children had stopped treating her like a visitor who might leave at any moment. They brought her their scraped knees and hurt feelings with the automatic trust of young ones who had found their safe harbor. Even Michael, initially the most suspicious, had begun seeking her advice on matters both practical and personal. It was during one of these consultations that Margaret discovered the depth of responsibility the 14-year-old had shouldered. "Mrs. Margaret," he said one evening after the younger children had gone to bed, "I need to ask you something, but you can't tell Pa." Margaret set down her mending and gave him her full attention. "What's troubling you, Michael?" The boy fidgeted, with the hem of his shirt, his usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. "It's about money. Pa thinks I don't know, but I've been keeping track of the household account since Mama died. We're not doing well." Margaret felt a chill of recognition. She'd become intimately familiar with the weight of financial worry during her marriage to Harold, watching every penny and stretching every resource to its limit. "How bad is it?" she asked gently. Michael pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, a careful accounting written in his precise adolescent handwriting. "We owe money to Fletcher's store, to the grain supplier, to the man who shoes our horses. Pa sold most of our cattle last spring to pay for Mama's medicine, but it wasn't enough to cover everything." Margaret studied the figures with growing concern. The McKenna family was living on the edge of financial collapse, held together by Thomas's pride and his children's ignorance of their true circumstances. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you're good with household things. And I thought maybe you might know ways to make money stretch further. And because—" Michael's voice dropped to a whisper, "because I'm scared we're going to lose the ranch." The trust implicit in his confession moved Margaret deeply. This boy had been carrying the weight of adult fears while trying to maintain childhood for his younger siblings. "Have you talked to your father about your concerns?" Michael shook his head vigorously. "He's got enough to worry about, and he gets this look sometimes like he's drowning, and I don't want to make it worse." Margaret understood that look. She'd seen it in Harold's face during their lean years, though his response had been to blame her for their troubles, rather than shoulder them himself. "Michael, your father loves you children more than his own life. He would want to know you're worried, but what if knowing makes him give up?" The question revealed the heart of Michael's fear. What if he decides it's too much and sends us to live with relatives or something? Margaret's heart ached for this young man, forced to contemplate scenarios no child should have to consider. "Your father would never abandon you. But you're right, that there might be ways to help with the finances. Let me think about it." The conversation stayed with Margaret through the following days, as she observed the household with new eyes. She noticed the careful way Thomas portioned out supplies, the way he mended clothes that should have been replaced, the shadows under. His eyes that spoke of sleepless nights spent calculating impossible sums. Her opportunity to help came in an unexpected form. Emma had been playing in the garden when she discovered a patch of wildflowers that had seeded themselves near the vegetable beds. Delicate purple blooms that Margaret recognized as particularly prized for their medicinal properties. "These are beautiful, sweetheart," Margaret said, kneeling beside the little girl. "Your mama must have planted them." "Are they special?" Emma asked, picking one carefully. "Very special. Some people pay good money for flowers like these when they're properly dried and prepared." That evening, Margaret approached Thomas with a proposal. "I'd like to expand the garden," she said. "Add some herbs and medicinal plants that could provide additional income." Thomas looked up from the harness he was mending. "Do you know about such things?" "My mother was known throughout our county for her herbal remedies. She taught me which plants have value and how to prepare them properly." It was the first time Margaret had mentioned her family, and Thomas seemed to recognize the significance. "What would you need?" Seeds, mostly, and some simple supplies for drying and storing. The initial investment would be small, but the return could be substantial if we do it right. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. We don't have much money. For investments, even small ones. Margaret had anticipated this concern. I have a little money set aside. I'd like to contribute it to our household. The word "our" hung in the air between them, carrying implications neither had explicitly discussed. Thomas met her gaze steadily. "This is your home too, isn't it?" he said finally. "I'd like it to be." That night, Emma presented Margaret with a carefully pressed wildflower, a purple bloom, flattened between the pages of her picture book, and offered with the solemnity of a 4-year-old, bestowing a precious gift. "It's for you," Emma said shyly. "So you'll remember today." Margaret accepted the flower with the gravity it deserved, understanding instinctively that this simple gesture represented something profound, a child's recognition of belonging, of family bonds that transcended blood relations. "I'll keep it." "Always?" Margaret promised, and meant it. As summer progressed, Margaret's garden project became a family endeavor. The twins helped plant seeds in carefully marked rows. Jimmy built protective frames to shield delicate seedlings from harsh weather, and even Michael contributed his organizational skills to planning the most efficient use of space. Thomas watched their efforts with growing admiration, and Margaret caught him smiling more often, genuine expressions of contentment that transformed his weathered face. The moments of domestic harmony felt precious and fragile, like soap bubbles that might burst if examined too closely. But it was during one of these peaceful evenings that their first real test arrived. Margaret was hanging laundry on the line when she noticed a rider approaching the ranch, a well-dressed man on a fine horse, clearly not one of the neighboring farmers who occasionally stopped by. Something about his bearing made her stomach clench with inexplicable dread. "Thomas!" she called, but he was already walking out to meet the visitor, his posture alert and wary. The conversation that followed was too distant for Margaret to hear. Clearly, but she could see the tension in Thomas's shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. When the man finally rode away, Thomas stood motionless for a long moment before walking slowly back to the house. "Who was that?" Margaret asked as he entered the kitchen. "Bank representative," Thomas said curtly. "Seems our mortgage payment is overdue." The simple words carried the weight of catastrophe. Margaret felt the carefully constructed piece of their household trembling on its foundation. "How overdue? 3 months?" Thomas sank into a chair, suddenly looking older than his years. "I've been juggling payments, hoping the cattle sales would cover everything, but it wasn't enough." Thomas shook his head. "They're giving us 6 weeks to bring the account current, or they'll begin foreclosure proceedings." Margaret felt the familiar panic of financial crisis, but underneath it was something new, a fierce protectiveness for this family that had become her own. They had built something beautiful here, something worth fighting for. "How much do we need?" she asked. Thomas named a sum that made Margaret's heart sink. It was more than her herb garden could produce in a year, more than they could earn through any conventional means in 6 weeks. But as she looked around the kitchen, where Emma's drawings decorated the walls, where the twins' hair ribbons hung, from a peg by the door, where Michael's schoolbooks sat stacked beside his father's ranch ledgers, Margaret felt something crystallize in her chest. This was her family now. This was her home, and she would not let anyone take it away from them. "We'll find a way," she said with quiet determination. "Together, we'll find a way." Thomas looked at her with something that might have been hope, and Margaret felt the full weight of the promise she'd just made. 6 weeks to save not just a ranch, but the future of 5 children who had learned to trust her with their hearts. The pressed wildflower Emma had given her lay carefully preserved between the pages of Sarah's Bible, a reminder that sometimes the most precious things grew in the most unlikely places. Now she had to make sure those tender shoots had the chance to flourish. The discovery of Sarah's recipe book came by accident, tucked away in the back of the pantry behind jars of preserves that had been untouched since her death. Margaret found it while searching for ways to stretch their remaining supplies, her fingers closing around the leather-bound volume with its pages yellowed by kitchen steam and marked with the careful notations of a devoted homemaker. "Thomas," she called softly, emerging from the pantry with the book in her hands. He looked up from the kitchen table where he'd been hunched over the ranch accounts, trying to find money that simply wasn't there. When he saw what she held, his expression grew complex. "I haven't looked at that since—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Margaret understood. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the book. Thomas nodded, though she could see the effort it cost. Him. Margaret opened the cover carefully, revealing page after page of recipes written in Sarah's neat handwriting. But these weren't just instructions for daily meals. They were detailed formulations for specialized baked goods, preserves, and medicinal preparations that spoke of a woman with considerable skill and business acumen. "Sarah sold her baking to the hotel in town," Thomas said quietly, seeing Margaret's interest in the more elaborate recipes. "Her apple pies were famous throughout the county. People would travel from 3 towns over just to taste her cinnamon rolls." Margaret studied a particularly detailed recipe for something called Sarah's Healing Honey Cakes, a complex preparation that combined several of the medicinal herbs Margaret had been cultivating. The margins were filled with notes about pricing, special orders, and customer preferences. She was running a business, Margaret said with growing excitement. "A small one. Nothing that would solve our current problems." Thomas's voice carried the weight of a man who had considered and discarded every possible solution, but Margaret was already seeing possibilities he couldn't imagine. "Thomas, what if it wasn't small? What if we could expand on what Sarah built?" She spread the recipe book open on the table, pointing to the detailed records Sarah had kept. "Look at these orders. The hotel wanted 12 pies every weekend during the summer season. The church ordered her honey cakes for every funeral and wedding. The doctor regularly bought her chamomile preparations for his patients." "That was Sarah," Thomas said. "She had a reputation, connections built over years. No one knows you here, Margaret. They won't trust your cooking the way they trusted hers." Margaret. He felt a flash of hurt at his words, but she pushed it aside. He was speaking from grief and desperation, not cruelty. "Then we'll have to earn their trust," she said simply. "We have 6 weeks. That's enough time to prove what I can do." The conversation was interrupted by Emma bursting through the kitchen door, her face flushed with excitement and her hands full of wildflowers. Mrs. Margaret, look what I found." She thrust the bouquet toward Margaret with 4-year-old enthusiasm. "They're everywhere by the creek and they smell like honey." Margaret examined the flowers with growing excitement. They were chamomile, wild chamomile that had seeded itself throughout the property. In the city, these delicate blooms sold for premium prices to apothecaries and tea merchants. "Emma, sweetheart, you've made a wonderful discovery," Margaret said, kneeling to the child's level. "These flowers are very special indeed." Over the following days, Margaret threw herself into planning with the same intensity Thomas brought to his ranch work. She inventoried every edible and medicinal plant on the property, tested and refined Sarah's recipes, and began the careful process of building relationships with potential customers in town. Her first breakthrough came at Fletcher's General Store, where she offered samples of her chamomile tea to curious customers. The gentle, honey-scented brew earned appreciative murmurs and several immediate orders. "This is every bit as good as what Sarah used to make," Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, declared. "Perhaps better." Margaret felt a glow of pride at the compliment, but also a pang of concern. She didn't want to replace Sarah in people's memories. She wanted to honor her legacy while creating something uniquely her own. Her second success came through the twins, who proudly announced to their teacher that their new almost mama could bake better than anyone in 3 counties. This innocent boast led to a request from the schoolmom for a special cake for the end-of-term celebration. Margaret Spent hours perfecting the recipe, combining Sarah's basic cake formula with her own knowledge of flavor combinations. The result was a delicate honey cake studded with wild berries and finished with a glaze that caught the light like amber. When she delivered it to the school, the response was immediate and enthusiastic. The schoolma'am ordered 6 more for various upcoming events, and word began to spread through the community about the McKenna Ranch's exceptional baking. But it was Thomas's response that meant the most to Margaret. She found him late one night in the kitchen, carefully reading through Sarah's recipe book, with an expression of wonder. "I never knew she'd documented everything so thoroughly," he said without looking up. "Her recipes, her customer notes, even her plans for expanding the business." Margaret sat down across from him, noting the way his fingers traced his late wife's handwriting with reverent care. "She was building something for your family's future," Margaret said gently. "Something we can continue building." Thomas looked up then, his storm-grey eyes searching her face. "We, if you'll let me. If you think Sarah would approve of someone else using her recipes, her connections." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering. Sarah always said this. Ranch should be more than just cattle and crops. She wanted it to be a place where the community could come for healing, both physical and spiritual. Your herb garden, this baking business, the way you've brought peace to our household. I think she would approve very much. The words settled into Margaret's heart like a benediction. To have not just Thomas's acceptance, but his belief that Sarah herself would have welcomed her efforts, felt like the final piece of belonging she hadn't realized she was missing. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats in the yard, unusual for such a late hour. Thomas moved to the window, his expression growing grim. "Riders coming fast," he said. 3 of them. Margaret felt a chill of premonition. In her experience, nothing good came from unexpected visitors after dark. Thomas reached for the rifle that hung over the mantelpiece, checking the load with practiced efficiency. "Take the children upstairs," he said quietly. "If there's trouble, get them out through Emma's window. There's a trellis they can climb down." Margaret nodded, her mouth suddenly dry. But as she moved toward the stairs, she realized the children were already awake, drawn by the sound of approaching horses. Michael appeared at the top of the stairs, his young face set in lines of premature responsibility. "Pa, what's happening?" "Probably nothing, son. Just taking precautions." But Margaret could see the tension in Thomas's shoulders, the way his hands gripped the rifle. Whatever was coming, he expected trouble. The riders pulled up in front of the house, their horses snorting and stamping in the cool night air. Margaret herded the children into Emma's room, but she couldn't resist peering through the curtains to see what threat had arrived at their door. What she saw made her blood run cold. One of the riders was Harold Whitmore, her former husband, and he was arguing with Thomas in low, urgent tones. Even at a distance, she could see the anger in Harold's posture, the aggressive way he gestured toward the house, toward her. Margaret's hands began to shake as the full implications hit her. Harold had found her. After all these weeks of peace and growing happiness, her past had caught up with her. And now, not only was her own precarious future at stake, but she had potentially brought danger to the family she'd come to love as her own. The children clustered around her, sensing her distress even if they couldn't understand its source. Emma climbed into her lap, and the twins pressed close to her sides, their faith in her protection absolute and heartbreaking. "Mrs. Margaret," Katie whispered. "What's wrong?" Margaret struggled to keep her voice steady. "Nothing, sweetheart. Just some business with your papa." But as she watched Harold's increasingly agitated gestures and saw Thomas's stance grow more defensive, Margaret knew that everything they'd built together was about to be tested in ways none of them were prepared for. The pressed wildflower Emma had given her seemed to mock her now from its place in Sarah's Bible. Some precious things, Margaret realized with growing dread, were too fragile to survive the storms that life inevitably brought. The confrontation in the yard stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Margaret watched through the window as Harold gestured aggressively toward the house, his voice carrying on the night air, though she couldn't make out the words. Thomas stood his ground, the rifle held casually but ready, his posture radiating the kind of quiet menace that came from a man protecting his family. Finally, Harold remounted his horse, but not before pointing directly at the window, where Margaret stood, hidden behind the curtain. The message was clear. He knew she was there, and this wasn't over. When the three riders disappeared into the darkness, Margaret's legs gave out beneath her. She sank onto Emma's small bed, the children clustering around her with worried faces. Mrs. Margaret? Michael's voice carried the authority of his 14 years. Who was that man? Before Margaret could formulate an answer, Thomas's heavy footsteps sounded on the stairs. He appeared in the doorway, his face grim but his voice gentle when he addressed the children. Back to your beds, all of you. Everything's fine. But Pa... Jimmy started to protest. Now! Thomas's tone brooked no argument. The children scattered reluctantly, though Margaret caught Michael lingering in the hallway, clearly intending to eavesdrop. Thomas noticed too. Michael, that includes you. We'll talk in the morning. When they were alone, Thomas sat heavily in the chair by Emma's window, suddenly looking every one of his years, and then some. That was Harold Whitmore, he said without preamble. Margaret nodded, unable to trust her voice. He wants you back. The simple statement hit Margaret like a physical blow. What did you tell him? I told him that any business he had with you would need to be conducted through proper legal channels, during daylight hours, with witnesses present. Thomas's jaw worked as he controlled his temper. He seemed to think he had some kind of claim on you. Margaret's hands twisted in her lap. He does. Legally, I'm still his wife, and according to the law... She forced herself to say the words that tasted like poison. According to the law, he has the right to reclaim his property. Property. Thomas spoke the word like a curse. You're not property, Margaret. You're a human being with rights and dignity. The law doesn't see it that way. Especially not for a woman who was publicly sold like livestock. Margaret's voice broke on the last words. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the windowsill. There's something else, he said finally. Harold didn't come alone. One of the men with him was Sheriff Bradshaw from the county seat. The other... Thomas paused as if the words were difficult to speak. The other was a federal marshal. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. A federal marshal? But why? That's what I'd like to know. Thomas turned to look at her directly. Margaret, is there something you haven't told me? Some reason the federal government would be interested in your situation? Margaret searched her mind frantically, but came up empty. I don't understand. I'm nobody special. Just a failed wife that Harold wanted to be rid of. Failed wives don't usually warrant federal attention, Thomas observed, unless there's more to your story than either of us knows. The implication hung between them like a sword. Margaret had been honest about her circumstances, or so she'd believed, but clearly there were forces at work that she didn't understand. What did Harold say, exactly? Thomas's expression grew darker. He said, you'd stolen something that belonged to him, something valuable enough to involve federal authorities in recovering. I didn't steal anything. Margaret's protest came out sharper than she intended. I left with nothing but the clothes on my back. Harold made sure of that. I believe you, Thomas said quietly. But someone thinks you have something worth a lot of trouble to retrieve. They were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Pa? Emma's small voice came through the wood. I had another bad dream. Margaret automatically rose to comfort the child, but Thomas caught her hand. Wait, he said quietly. Before this goes any further, I need to know. Do you want to go? Back with him? The question stopped Margaret cold. In all her fear and confusion, she hadn't considered that Thomas might think she would choose to return to Harold voluntarily. Never, she said with fierce certainty. I would rather die than go back to that life. Thomas studied her face in the dim light. Then we'll find another way. Whatever Harold thinks you have, whatever the law says about your status, you're part of this family now. We don't abandon our own. The simple declaration of loyalty brought tears to Margaret's eyes. When was the last time anyone had stood up for her so unequivocally? They let Emma sleep between them in the big bed that night, the little girl's presence, serving as both comfort and reminder of what was at stake. But Margaret lay awake long after the others had found sleep, her mind racing through possibilities and coming up short on solutions. The answer came the next morning in the most unexpected way. Margaret was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard the sound of another rider approaching. Her heart clenched with fear that Harold had returned, but when she looked through the window, she saw an elderly woman she didn't recognize, dismounting from a sturdy mare. The woman was perhaps 60, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a practical bun and clothes that spoke of comfortable prosperity. She moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to and obeyed. Thomas emerged from the barn to greet her, and Margaret could see surprise and something like respect in his posture. Their conversation was animated, but too distant to overhear. Finally, Thomas gestured toward the house, and the woman nodded firmly. "Margaret," Thomas called as they approached the kitchen door. "There's someone here who needs to speak with you." The woman entered with the assurance of invited authority, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the kitchen before settling on Margaret's face. "Mrs. Whitmore, I presume," she said in a voice that carried the cultured tones of education and breeding. "I'm Judge Eleanor Hartwell from the territorial capital. I believe we need to have a very serious conversation." Margaret felt her knees weaken. A federal judge. Harold hadn't just brought a sheriff and a marshal, he'd brought the full weight of the territorial government down on her head. "Please, sit down," Judge Hartwell said, not unkindly. "What I have to tell you may come as quite a shock." Margaret sank into a chair, Thomas moving protectively to stand behind her. The judge opened a leather satchel and withdrew several official-looking documents. "Mrs. Whitmore, are you familiar with the last will and testament of one Jeremiah Whitmore of Boston, Massachusetts?" Margaret stared at her blankly. No, I don't know anyone by that name. He was Harold Whitmore's uncle, a very wealthy man, who made his fortune in shipping and died without direct heirs 3 months ago." Judge Hartwell's expression was grave. "According to his will, his entire estate, valued at approximately $200,000, was left to the wife of my nephew Harold in recognition of her faithful service to our family name." The kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of the wall clock. Margaret felt as though the world had tilted sideways. "$200," she whispered. $1,000. Judge Hartwell confirmed. "Mrs. Whitmore, you are potentially one of the wealthiest women in the territory, and that, I suspect, is why your husband is so eager to have you back." Margaret's mind reeled. $200,000, more money than she could have imagined in her wildest dreams, enough to save the ranch, to secure the children's futures, to buy freedom itself. "But I don't understand," she managed. "Why? Would his uncle leave me anything? I never even met the man." Judge Hartwell's expression softened slightly. "According to the letters we found among his effects, Jeremiah Whitmore was deeply concerned about Harold's treatment of you. He'd been making inquiries about your welfare for some time. The inheritance was his way of ensuring you would have the means to support yourself independently should you ever need to. But Harold..." Margaret's voice trailed off as the full implications hit her. "Harold cannot inherit while you live," Judge Hartwell said bluntly. "And according to territorial law, any inheritance you receive during marriage becomes your separate property if it's specifically designated as such, which this one was. Harold has no legal claim to your uncle-in-law's money." Thomas's hands settled on Margaret's shoulders, warm and steadying. "What does this mean, practically speaking?" Judge Hartwell smiled for the first time since arriving. "It means, Mr. McKenna, that Mrs. Whitmore has the financial means to secure her own future, including, if she chooses, purchasing her freedom from a marriage that was clearly entered into under false pretenses." Margaret looked up at Thomas, seeing her own stunned amazement reflected in his eyes. In the space of a single conversation, she had gone from being a penniless refugee to being one of the wealthiest women in the territory. But more importantly, she had found the means to protect the family that had become everything to her. Judge Hartwell, Margaret said, her voice growing stronger with each word, what would I need to do to claim this inheritance? The judge's smile widened. Simply sign these papers, Mrs. Whitmore, and then we'll have a very interesting conversation with your husband about the true nature of property ownership. The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of legal preparations and strategic planning. Judge Hartwell had taken up temporary residence at the hotel in town, working with Margaret to ensure every document was properly executed and every legal protection was in place. But Margaret knew that Harold wouldn't accept defeat gracefully, and the waiting for his next move stretched her nerves to the breaking point. It was during one of these preparation sessions that Thomas revealed a side of himself Margaret had never suspected. I need to show you something, he said quietly, leading her to a wooden chest tucked away in the corner of their bedroom, the room that had become theirs without formal discussion, though they maintained careful propriety in front of the children. Thomas opened the chest with reverent care, revealing layers of carefully preserved items. On top lay a blue uniform coat, its brass buttons tarnished but still bearing the distinctive markings of the Union cavalry. You were in the war, Margaret said, softly. Though it wasn't really a question, many men of Thomas's generation carried those scars, visible and invisible. 3rd Colorado Cavalry, Thomas confirmed, lifting the coat to reveal what lay beneath, a collection of medals and commendations that spoke of exceptional service. I was a scout and tracker, specializing in what they called unconventional warfare. Margaret examined the medals with growing amazement. The Congressional Medal of Honor lay among them, along with numerous citations for bravery and tactical innovation. This wasn't the record of an ordinary soldier. This was the history of a war hero. Thomas, these are extraordinary. Why didn't you ever? Because that part of my life was over, Thomas said simply. When I married Sarah and started this ranch, I wanted to be a man of peace, a farmer, a father, a neighbor, not a killer. His hands trembled slightly as he handled the medals. But now, with Harold threatening our family, Margaret understood. The warrior Thomas had buried was awakening in response to a threat against those he loved. What exactly are you planning? Thomas's smile was grim. Harold and his friends think they're dealing with a simple rancher who'll roll over when faced with federal authority. They're about to learn otherwise. Over the following days, Thomas quietly began reaching out to old contacts, men who had served with him, settled throughout the territory, and maintained the bonds forged in war's crucible. Margaret watched in amazement as a network of support materialized around them. Sheriff Williams from the next county arrived first, a grizzled veteran who greeted Thomas with the easy familiarity of shared campaigns. Behind him came a steady stream of others, ranchers, shopkeepers, even a few who wore the badges of local law enforcement. All men who owed Thomas their lives or their freedom, and all ready to stand with him against whatever Harold might try. You saved my bacon at Glorietta Pass, one of them told Margaret when she expressed her amazement at their loyalty. Tommy McKenna was the finest soldier I ever served with, and the best man I ever knew. We don't forget that kind of debt. But it was the children's response to the growing tension that moved Margaret most deeply. Rather than being frightened by the presence of armed men and serious conversations, they seemed to understand instinctively that these preparations were about protecting their family. Michael appointed himself as Margaret's personal guardian, rarely leaving her side when Thomas was away planning. The twins took turns keeping watch from the upstairs windows, reporting on any approaching riders with the seriousness of seasoned sentinels. Jimmy practiced his reading aloud to Margaret in the evenings, as if ensuring she would remember his voice if they were separated, and Emma, precious Emma, presented Margaret with a carefully wrapped bundle one morning before breakfast. "I made you something," the little girl said solemnly. Inside the cloth wrapping was a small doll, crude but lovingly crafted from scraps of fabric and yarn. Unlike Emma's own mama doll, this one had been dressed in a miniature version of Margaret's everyday dress, complete with a tiny apron and carefully embroidered features. "It's you," Emma explained unnecessarily, "so if the bad men take you away, I'll still have a mama to hold." Margaret's throat closed with emotion. "Oh, sweetheart, no one is going to take me away from you, I promise. But what if they try?" Margaret knelt to Emma's level, looking directly into the child's trusting eyes. "Then they'll have to go through your papa and me and all our friends, and we're much stronger than any bad men." Emma nodded solemnly, apparently satisfied with this explanation. But that night, Margaret found the little girl's crude doll sitting on her bedside table, a talisman against an uncertain future and a reminder of the love that now anchored her to this place. Judge Hartwell returned on Thursday with news that crystallized their situation. "Harold has filed a formal petition with the territorial court," she announced. "He's claiming that your inheritance is fraudulent, that you exerted undue influence over his uncle, and that as your husband, he has the right to manage any assets you might possess." Margaret felt her hard-won confidence waver. "Can he do that?" "He can try," Judge Hartwell said grimly. "And if he can find a sympathetic judge, which isn't impossible in this territory, he might succeed. At least temporarily." Thomas spoke up from where he'd been listening intently. "What are our options? We can fight it in court, of course. But that could take months. And in the meantime, Harold could petition for custody of Margaret pending the resolution of the inheritance dispute." The casual mention of custody made Margaret's blood run cold. The idea of being forced to return to Harold while lawyers argued over her future was unbearable. "There is another option," Judge Hartwell continued carefully, "a more permanent solution that would resolve both the inheritance issue and Margaret's marital status definitively." Margaret and Thomas exchanged glances. "What kind of solution?" "Divorce," Judge Hartwell said simply. "On grounds of abandonment and cruelty, Harold's public sale of his wife provides ample evidence of both. With the right legal strategy, we could have your marriage dissolved within a matter of weeks." The "E" word hung in the air like a gift and a challenge combined. Margaret had never seriously considered the possibility of divorce. Such things were scandalous, expensive, and rarely granted to women. But Judge Hartwell was offering her a path to complete freedom. What would that mean practically? Thomas asked, his voice carefully neutral. It would mean Margaret's inheritance would be unquestionably hers alone. It would mean Harold would have no legal claim on her person or her property. And it would mean, Judge Hartwell paused significantly, it would mean she would be free to make her own choices about her future relationships. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks as the judge's meaning became clear. Free to remarry if she chose. Free to build a life with someone who valued her as more than chattel. "How quickly could such proceedings be initiated?" Thomas asked. "I could file the papers tomorrow, but Margaret would need to be prepared for Harold's response. He won't give up his claim to her inheritance without a fight. And desperate men sometimes resort to desperate measures." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching horses echoed from the yard. But this time, the riders weren't bothering with the pretense of peaceful visit. Margaret counted at least 6 men, all armed, with Harold at their head. Thomas was already moving toward his rifle when Judge Hartwell caught his arm. "Wait," she said quietly. "Let me handle this first. As an officer of the territorial court, I have certain authorities that might be useful here." Margaret watched through the window as Judge Hartwell strode into the yard with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Harold's initial bluster seemed to falter when she identified herself and produced her credentials. The conversation that followed was heated but civil, with Judge Hartwell clearly laying down legal boundaries that even Harold didn't dare cross. Openly, finally she returned to the house, her expression grim but satisfied. "Harold is demanding a face-to-face meeting with Margaret," she announced. "He claims he has information that will change her mind about pursuing the inheritance." "What kind of information?" Margaret asked. "He wouldn't say, but he did agree to meet in town in public with witnesses present. No private conversations, no attempts to remove you from the premises." Thomas shook his head immediately. "It's too dangerous. Whatever he has to say can be said through legal channels." But Margaret felt a spark of the determination that had carried her through Harold's worst abuses. "No," she said quietly. "I want to hear what he has to say. I want to face him one more time, as a free woman instead of his property." "Margaret!" "Thomas, I appreciate your concern, but I've spent too many years being afraid of Harold Whitmore. If I'm going to claim my independence, I need to start by showing that I'm not afraid of him anymore." Judge Hartwell nodded approvingly. "Very well. Tomorrow at noon, in the town square, Sheriff Williams and several of Thomas's friends will provide security, and I'll ensure everything is conducted according to legal protocols." That evening, as Margaret tucked the children into bed, she felt the weight of the approaching confrontation settling on her shoulders. Tomorrow would determine not just her financial future, but the very nature of her freedom. "Mrs. Margaret," Emma whispered as Margaret bent to kiss her goodnight, "are you going to stay with us forever now?" Margaret smoothed the child's hair with trembling fingers. "I'm going to try my very best to make that happen, sweetheart." "Good," Emma said with 4-year-old certainty, "because we love you, and you belong here." As Margaret closed the door to Emma's room, she carried those words with her like armor. Whatever Harold had planned for tomorrow's meeting, whatever tricks or threats he intended to deploy, she would face them with the knowledge that she was fighting not just for her own freedom, but for the future of a family that had chosen to love her. The wooden doll Emma had made sat on her bedside table, its simple features somehow radiating the fierce protectiveness of maternal love. Tomorrow, Margaret would discover whether love was strong enough to overcome law, whether justice could triumph over legal technicalities, and whether a woman once sold like livestock could claim her rightful place as the protector of those who had made her whole. The town square of Cedar Ridge had never seen such a gathering. Word of the confrontation had spread through the community like wildfire, and it seemed every resident had found reason to conduct business in the vicinity of the meeting. Margaret arrived with Thomas and Judge Hartwell to find a crowd of perhaps 50 people arranged in a loose circle around the designated meeting spot. Harold stood waiting with his contingent, Sheriff Bradshaw, the federal marshal, and 3 other men Margaret didn't recognize. Their formal bearing and expensive clothes marked them as lawyers or government officials, and Margaret felt a chill of apprehension at the weight of authority arrayed against her. But Thomas's veterans had positioned themselves strategically throughout the crowd, their casual presence providing a subtle but unmistakable show of support. Sheriff Williams stood near the front with his hand resting easily on his gun belt, and Margaret caught sight of at least 6 other men she recognized from the ranch visits of recent days. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Harold called out as she approached, his voice carrying the false heartiness he'd always used when trying to impress others with his magnanimity. "I'm so glad you've come to your senses about this unfortunate misunderstanding." Margaret stopped a careful distance away, Judge Hartwell at her side, and Thomas just behind her left shoulder. The family shotgun rested casually in the crook of his arm, not threatening, but visible. "Harold," Margaret said, proud that her voice came out steady and clear, "Judge Hartwell tells me you have something to discuss regarding the inheritance." Harold's smile faltered slightly at her formal tone. "Margaret, surely we can speak privately, as husband and wife should. This public spectacle is unnecessary." "I prefer witnesses," Margaret replied calmly. One of Harold's companions, a thin man with the predatory look of a practiced legal manipulator, stepped forward. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm Attorney Morrison from the territorial capital. I think you should be aware that your current situation has placed you in potential legal jeopardy." "What kind of jeopardy?" Judge Hartwell interjected, her voice sharp. With professional interest, Morrison produced a sheaf of papers with theatrical flourish. "Adultery, Your Honor. Mrs. Whitmore has been cohabitating with Mr. McKenna in an unmarried state while still legally bound to my client. Under territorial law, this constitutes grounds for criminal prosecution." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. She had been so focused on the inheritance and her desire for freedom that she hadn't considered how her living arrangements might be interpreted by hostile legal minds. "That's preposterous," Thomas said, his voice dangerous. "Mrs. Whitmore has her own room and has conducted herself with complete propriety." "Nevertheless," Morrison continued smoothly, "the appearance of impropriety is sufficient for charges to be filed, unless, of course, Mrs. Whitmore returns to her lawful husband and abandons these frivolous claims regarding the inheritance." The crowd had grown quiet, listening intently to the legal maneuvering. Margaret could see the calculation in Harold's eyes. He thought he had found the leverage to force her compliance. But something had been growing in Margaret during the weeks at the McKenna ranch, something Harold had never seen before, because he'd never bothered to look. Strength, purpose, the fierce protectiveness of a woman defending not just herself, but the family she'd chosen to love. "Mr. Morrison," Margaret said, stepping forward slightly, "are you suggesting that criminal charges would be dropped if I agreed to return to my husband? I'm suggesting that district attorneys are often willing to exercise discretion in cases where the accused shows proper remorse and takes steps to correct their behavior." It was bribery disguised as legal advice, and everyone present knew it. Margaret heard angry murmurs from the crowd, saw Sheriff Williams's hand tighten on his. Gunbelt felt Thomas's protective presence at her back like a wall of stone. "And if I refuse," Harold spoke up, his mask of civility finally slipping, "then you'll find yourself in territorial prison while I manage the inheritance you're too simple-minded to handle properly." The casual cruelty in his voice, the same tone he'd used throughout their marriage when explaining why her opinions didn't matter, crystallized something in Margaret's chest. She thought of Emma's tears over her broken doll, of Michael's quiet fears about losing the ranch, of the twins learning to read with her patient guidance, of Jimmy's proud smile when he mastered a difficult arithmetic problem. She thought of Thomas's gentle hands crafting a wooden spoon just for her, of the way he looked at her not as property but as a partner, of the possibility of building something beautiful and lasting with a man who valued her mind as much as her domestic skills. Most of all, she thought of the shotgun Thomas carried, not just as a weapon, but as a symbol of her right to defend what she'd built, what she'd become, what she refused to surrender. "Mr. Morrison," Margaret said, her voice carrying across the silent square, "I believe you've made an error in your legal reasoning." The lawyer's eyebrows rose skeptically. "Oh? And what error might that be?" Margaret reached into her reticule and withdrew the document Judge Hartwell had prepared the night before. Divorce papers, filed with the territorial court and officially served just that morning. "The error," Margaret said clearly, "is in assuming I'm still married to Harold Whitmore." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the whisper of wind through the cottonwood trees that lined the square. Harold's face went through a series of expressions, confusion, disbelief, and finally rage as the implications sank in. "You can't," he sputtered. "Women don't. Women with proper legal representation do," Judge Hartwell said smoothly, stepping forward to stand beside Margaret. "The papers were filed at dawn this morning. The marriage is dissolved pending final court approval, which, given the circumstances of your public sale of your wife, should be forthcoming within the week." Margaret felt the power of that moment settle into her bones. For the first time in her adult life, she stood as her own person, making her own choices, defending her own ground. Harold's rage erupted like a storm that had been building for weeks. "You scheming witch!" he snarled, all pretense of civilized behavior abandoned. "You think you can steal what's rightfully mine? I'll see you in prison before I let you get away with this." He lunged toward Margaret, but Thomas moved faster than lightning, the shotgun coming up in a smooth, practiced motion that spoke of years of military training. The distinctive sound of the hammer being cocked echoed across the silent square. "That's far enough, Harold," Thomas said quietly, but his voice carried the unmistakable authority of a man who had commanded soldiers in battle. Sheriff Bradshaw reached for his weapon, but found himself facing the business end of Sheriff Williams's, a rifle. Around the square, Thomas's veteran friends had materialized from the crowd, each one armed and ready. The federal marshal looked around nervously, clearly realizing that he and his companions were vastly outnumbered by men who knew exactly what they were doing. "You're all making a grave mistake," Attorney Morrison said, his voice high with panic. "This is obstruction of federal justice. You're interfering with lawful—" "Lawful what?" Judge Hartwell interrupted sharply. "Lawful extortion? Lawful intimidation of a woman exercising her legal rights?" She turned to address the crowd, her voice carrying clearly across the square. "Citizens of Cedar Ridge, you are witnessing an attempt to subvert territorial law for personal gain. Mr. Whitmore and his associates are trying to use federal authority to steal an inheritance that legally belongs to Mrs. Whitmore." A murmur ran through the crowd, anger building like pressure in a kettle. These were frontier people who had little patience for legal bullying and strong opinions about justice. "She's my wife," Harold shouted desperately. "Whatever money there is belongs to the family." "Was your wife," Margaret corrected, stepping forward despite Thomas's protective presence. The fear that had controlled her for so many years was gone, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. "And you forfeited any claim to family consideration when you sold me like a cow at market." Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, gasped audibly. "Harold Whitmore, you did no such thing." "He did indeed," Margaret said, turning to address the crowd directly. 3 months ago, in this very square, Harold announced that his barren wife was available for trade to anyone who could offer value in return. When no one stepped forward, he cast me out with nothing but the clothes on my back. The crowd's murmur turned ugly. Whatever legal technicalities might be involved, the moral equation was clear to everyone present. A man who would sell his wife had forfeited any claim to sympathy or support. "That's different," Harold protested. "She was useless to me. Couldn't give me children, couldn't manage a household properly, couldn't—" "Couldn't what?" Thomas's voice cut across Harold's complaints like a blade. "Couldn't tolerate being treated like property? Couldn't pretend to love a man who valued her less than livestock?" Thomas handed his shotgun to Sheriff Williams and stepped forward until he was almost nose to nose with Harold. For a moment Margaret feared violence, but Thomas's control was absolute. "Harold Whitmore," Thomas said in a voice that carried to every corner of the square, "I want you to understand something very clearly. Margaret isn't your wife anymore. She isn't your property. She isn't your anything. She's a free woman who can choose her own path. And I choose this," Margaret said, moving to stand beside Thomas. "I choose this man, this family, this life. Not because I have to, but because I want to." She reached into her reticule and withdrew a small object that caught the afternoon sunlight. A pair of wedding rings, simple gold bands that the local blacksmith had crafted according to her specifications. "Thomas McKenna," she said clearly, loud enough for everyone to hear, "will you marry me?" The question hung in the air like a bell's toll. Margaret had turned every social convention on its head. Women didn't propose to men, especially not in public squares in front of hostile ex-husbands and federal marshals. But she was claiming her right to choose, her power to determine her own future. Thomas's storm-grey eyes searched her face for a long moment. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his weathered features, the first truly joyful expression she'd ever seen him wear. "Margaret Whitmore," he said, taking the rings from her trembling hands. "It would be my honor to be your husband." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Someone shouted, "About time!" And Mrs. Henderson called out, "Judge Hartwell, you can perform the ceremony right now, can't you?" Judge Hartwell smiled broadly. As a matter of fact, I can, and given the circumstances, I think it would be appropriate to settle this matter permanently. Harold made one last, desperate attempt to intervene. You can't. The inheritance, the law, Judge Hartwell said firmly, recognizes Mrs. Whitmore's right to inherit, to divorce, and to remarry as she chooses. And as of this moment, all three actions are complete and legal. As Thomas slipped the ring onto Margaret's finger, and she placed its mate on his, Margaret felt the last chains of her old life falling away. She was no longer Harold's discarded wife, or even Margaret Whitmore. She was Margaret McKenna, free. Woman, chosen bride, and mother to 5 children who were waiting at home for her return. The kiss Thomas gave her was gentle and reverent, but it tasted of forever. Around them, the crowd cheered and Harold's legal team began a hasty retreat, their bluff called and their threats rendered meaningless. Margaret was finally, truly free, and she had chosen to use that freedom to bind herself to love. 6 months later, Margaret McKenna stood in the doorway of her kitchen, watching the controlled chaos of a family preparing for their first official Christmas together. The room had been transformed from the neglected space she'd first encountered into the warm heart of a thriving household. Copper pots gleaming on clean shelves, herbs hanging in fragrant bundles from the rafters, and the constant bustle of children who felt secure enough to make joyful noise. Emma sat at the table carefully decorating sugar cookies with the serious concentration of a 5-year-old artist. Her doll, the original Mama that Margaret had repaired so many months ago, sat propped in a miniature chair beside her, now joined by the crude figure Emma had made for Margaret during those dark days when they'd feared separation. "Mrs. Mama," Emma said solemnly, using the title she'd invented when the formal adoption papers had been finalized. "Do you think Papa will like the cookies I made him?" Margaret smiled at the familiar question. Emma asked for reassurance about her father's approval at least twice daily, as if she couldn't quite believe that love could be reliable and permanent. "I think your Papa will treasure anything you make for him," Margaret replied, settling beside the little girl to admire her handiwork. "Just like he treasures you." The kitchen door opened to admit Thomas, stamping snow from his boots and bringing the crisp scent of winter air with him. His face was bright with cold and satisfaction, the expression of a man whose burdens had been lifted rather than simply endured. "How are my girls this morning?" he asked, hanging his coat on the peg that had once held Sarah's apron. The blue fabric now rested in the chest upstairs, carefully preserved, but no longer a daily reminder of loss. Instead, Margaret's own apron hung there, practical brown cotton that bore the honest stains of family meals and small disasters. "Papa!" Emma launched herself from her chair into Thomas's arms, cookie crumbs and all. "Look what I made." "Mrs. Mama helped, but I did all the decorating myself." Thomas examined the cookies with the gravity they deserved, making appreciative noises that sent Emma into giggles of delight. Margaret felt the familiar warmth spread through her chest, the daily miracle of watching this man love his children with such complete devotion. "Where are the others?" Thomas asked, settling Emma back at her work. "Michael's in the barn, checking on the new foal. The twins are upstairs arguing about hair ribbons, and Jimmy's supposed to be practicing his writing, but is probably reading adventure stories instead," Margaret replied. "The usual morning chaos." "Controlled." "A chaos," Thomas corrected, stealing a kiss as he passed her chair. "There's a difference." Indeed there was. The McKenna household was lively and sometimes loud, but it was chaos born of love and security rather than neglect and fear. The children still tested boundaries and squabbled among themselves, but they did so with the confidence of young ones who knew their place in the world was secure. Margaret's inheritance had transformed their material circumstances beyond recognition. The mortgage was paid in full. The ranch was expanding with new livestock and improved buildings, and a substantial sum had been set aside for each child's education. But more than that, the money had bought them time. Time for Thomas to focus on being a father instead of simply a provider. Time for Margaret to build her herb and baking business without the pressure of immediate necessity. Time for all of them to grow into the family they'd chosen to become. The business had flourished beyond Margaret's wildest expectations. Sarah's recipe book had proven to be the foundation for an enterprise that now supplied 3 hotels, 2 restaurants, and a growing list of private customers throughout the territory. The combination of Margaret's herbal knowledge and Sarah's baking expertise had created something unique and valuable, healing foods that nourished both body and spirit. "Mrs. McKenna," Thomas said, using her married name with the same pleasure he'd shown 6 months ago when she'd first claimed it. "There's something I need to discuss with you." Margaret looked up from the account ledgers she'd been reviewing. Thomas's expression was serious but not worried, the look of a man with important news rather than troubling concerns. "Judge Hartwell sent word from the territorial capital," he continued. "Harold's final appeal has been denied. The inheritance is yours free and clear, with no possibility of future legal challenge." Margaret felt a weight she hadn't realized she was still carrying lift from her shoulders. Though she'd been confident in Judge Hartwell's legal expertise, some small part of her had never stopped fearing that Harold might find a way to reclaim control over her life. "It's truly over then," she said softly. "Truly over," Thomas confirmed. "You're free in every sense of the word. Free." The word still felt strange and precious to Margaret, like a gift she wasn't quite sure she deserved. Free to choose her own path, to love whom she wished, to build the life that brought her joy, rather than simply enduring the one that had been imposed upon her. The kitchen filled with the thunder of feet on stairs as the other children made their morning descent. Michael appeared first, his 15-year-old frame seeming to grow inches every week, followed by the twins in matching dresses but with entirely different hairstyles, their latest declaration of independence. Jimmy brought up the rear, ink stains on his fingers that confirmed Margaret's suspicions about his morning activities. "Morning, Ma," Michael said, the casual endearment still sending warmth through Margaret's chest. It had taken him months to use it naturally, but now it rolled off his tongue as easily as breathing. "Morning, dear. How's the foal?" "Strong and healthy. Pa says I can start training her to lead next week." Margaret nodded, proud of the responsibility Thomas was gradually placing on his eldest son's shoulders. Michael was growing into a fine young man, serious when needed, but with enough youth left in him to find joy in simple pleasures. As the family settled around the breakfast table, Margaret looked at each face in turn. These children who had started as strangers were now as precious to her as if she'd carried them in her own womb. Thomas, who had begun as a desperate widower offering temporary shelter, had become the love she'd never dared to dream possible. The wooden spoon he'd carved for her hung from a hook by the stove, worn smooth from daily use, but still beautiful in its simple functionality. Like their marriage, it was practical and precious, built to last through years of service and wear. After breakfast, as Thomas departed for his morning ranch work and the children scattered to their various activities, Margaret found herself alone in the kitchen with the photograph they'd commissioned the previous month, a formal portrait of the complete McKenna family, all 7 of them arranged in the photographer's studio with careful dignity. In the photograph, Margaret sat with Emma on her lap and the twins flanking her chair, while Thomas stood behind them, with his hands resting protectively on Michael's and Jimmy's shoulders. They looked like what they were, a family bound not by accident of birth, but by choice, commitment, and love. Margaret traced the glass over her own image, marveling at the transformation. The woman in the photograph bore little resemblance to the broken creature who had been sold in the town square less than a year ago. This woman stood straight, smiled genuinely, and met the camera's gaze with confidence and peace. As she placed the photograph back on the mantel, Margaret caught sight of herself in the window glass, the same face but overlaid now with the reflection of a woman surrounded by all the evidence of a life well lived. A kitchen that hummed with purpose, children's voices calling from the yard, the sound of Thomas's laughter carrying on the winter air. She had been sold for her supposed worthlessness, discarded like broken pottery. But here, in this place, with these people, she had discovered her true value, not as a vessel for producing children or managing a household, but as a woman capable of loving and being loved in return. The pressed wildflower Emma had given her still rested between the pages of Sarah's Bible, a reminder that sometimes the most precious things took root in the most unexpected places. Margaret Whitmore had been planted in rocky soil and withered under harsh conditions. But Margaret McKenna had found fertile ground, and she was blooming at last.